Good evening. I'm Kevin Johnson, Dean of UC Davis School of Law, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight for this special evening honoring Justice Cruz Reynoso. Born into a farm worker family, Cruz Reynoso spent his life fighting racism and for the poor. He spent decades working in public service, advocating for workers, immigrants, and the indigent before becoming the first Latino justice on the California Supreme Court. Tonight, we're going to have the wonderful opportunity to hear from civil rights lawyers who will honor Cruz's civil rights legacy and discuss the continuation of his important social justice work. Well, sadly, and one of the reasons we're all here is in May, Cruz Reynoso passed away at age 90. And I want to recognize his son, Len Reed Reynoso, who's here tonight with us. Now, Cruz was a UC Davis Law School professor from 2001 to 2006. And he remained devoted to the law school as an emeritus professor. He taught students, he mentored students, he spoke at events, he attended faculty meetings, which basically no retired professor does. But he wanted the opportunity to provide me with, as he put it, constructive input. And he always did. He would talk to students as if they were friends, talk to faculty like they were friends, talk to them about the law, about public service, talk to people about how their families were. He won too many awards to mention, but I will mention that in 2000, President Clinton bestowed upon him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, Justice Reynoso attended community college, then Pomona College. He spent 2 years in the Army Counterintelligence Corps. He then enrolled at UC Berkeley School of Law, where he once told me that he was the best Latino in the entire class. Then went on to say that he was the only Latino in the entire class, the class of 1958. He said pretty often, actually, that he became a lawyer because he saw so many injustices. As I've mentioned many times, he's one of the nicest people you could ever want to meet. He had a gentle demeanor, had a good word to say for all, even those who didn't always say good things about him. But he would become much more forceful and much more adamant and much tougher when he felt what he called his justice bone twinge. Now, he began his legal career in El Centro, in the Imperial Valley. He started his own law practice to help ordinary people. In 1968, he became the director of California Rural Legal Assistance. He oversaw the efforts to ban the short-handled hoe, which broke the backs, literally, of farm workers. He fought the fight to end the use of DDT, the deadly pesticide that killed farm workers. Then Governor Ronald Reagan did his very best over a number of years to put CRLA out of business, to dismantle the organization. And Cruz Reynoso fought, and he won against a very popular governor. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, Cruz Reynoso, Sowing the Seeds of Justice, I encourage you to see it, to see how forceful, how tough, how resilient Cruz Reynoso was. Now, Cruz later became a law professor at the University of New Mexico. He later was appointed by Governor Brown to the local Court of Appeals, the 3rd Appellate District in Sacramento. Then he was appointed to the California Supreme Court. He served there until 1986, when in a recall vote, the voters of California decided that he should be recalled along with two other so-called liberal justices who conservatives did not want on the Supreme Court. He then returned to legal academia, went to the UCLA law faculty. He also began serving on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where he was involved in investigating the Rodney King violence in Los Angeles, and where he also was involved in investigating the election irregularities in Florida in the 2000 election. We were very fortunate in 2001 to have Cruz Reynoso become the inaugural holder of the Bucheever and Byrd Chair for the Study and Teaching of Freedom and Inequality. But his quest for justice never ended. Throughout his time here and throughout his retirement years, he would investigate many things, including a local killing of a farm worker in Woodland. He also chaired the task force that looked at the use by police of pepper spray against student protesters on this campus, not that far from here. And his critical report in that case helped the campus move past that incident, that horrible incident, that unforgivable incident. And he was able to suggest and help the campus make reforms to ensure that that would never happen again. I could say a lot more about my friend, Cruz Reynoso, but I want to thank you all for being here. As I mentioned before, I want to thank Len Reed Reynoso for being here in particular. Now I want to turn things over to Professor Raquel Donna, a dedicated civil rights activist in her own right, who will introduce our speakers and moderate the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, and thank you for being here, either in person or virtually, joining us to celebrate the life and legacy of Justice Cruz Reynoso. We are honored today by the presence, in person and virtually, of three civil rights giants who lead three of the most prominent civil rights organizations advancing the rights of Latinos and Latinas in the United States. Each of the honored guests knew Justice Reynoso, and each of them would probably tribute their own incredible contributions to civil rights and the legal academy as being deeply influenced by Justice Reynoso's civil rights legacy. Jose Padilla is the executive director of the California Rural Legal Assistance, and you heard Dean Johnson mention the role that CRLA had in Justice Reynoso's life. Jose, your life has many parallels to Justice Reynoso. You both came from humble beginnings. You are from the Imperial Valley, the son of farm workers. Justice Reynoso from Southern California, and also the son of farm workers. You both graduated from Berkeley Law, and you both made careers at CRLA fighting on behalf of migrant workers. I was trying to figure out when I was looking at your bio whether you and Justice Reynoso coincided at CRLA. As best as I can tell, you joined CRLA either right around the time that he left and a few years prior to his appointment to the California Supreme Court in 1982. So I look forward very much to letting you tell us a lot more about that period and your experiences at CRLA. Magda Perez is my colleague and faculty here at King Hall, who directs the Immigration Clinic, but is also the executive director of the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, which is the sister arm of CRLA, and was created specifically to be able to address the needs of undocumented farm workers and families, in part in response to the federal restrictions on the funding of legal services when it services undocumented individuals. You and I have had a chance to share stories about Justice Reynoso, who was also a member of our faculty. And I was actually amazed to learn from you that you met him when you were a law student. And Justice Reynoso, I had no idea, had actually applied to be dean here at King Hall. I also learned you guys organized a protest when he didn't get the job, so good for you, Amanda. We're so lucky that he came back later to join our community as a faculty member, and we owe a great deal of gratitude to Dean Johnson for convincing him to come back. And as you heard, although he retired in 2006, he remained devoted to King Hall and our students until almost the very end. In fact, I joined UC Davis in 2017, so that was more than a decade after his retirement. And I still got to enjoy seeing him at faculty meetings and engaging with him informally in the halls. Among the faculty, Magda, you are probably his closest friend or one of his closest friends. And it's amazing that you have had parallel trajectories promoting the rights of migrant workers and also propelling and inspiring the future generation of King lawyers who are following in your footsteps. And then we're going to hear from Tom Sines. It's always great to see you. I met you, of course, through a mutual friend and colleague, King Law Professor Leticia Saucedo, with whom you've worked and continue to work in the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, Malta, also known as the Latino legal voice for civil rights in America. You're also from Southern California, and I'm sure that Justice Reynoso must have been so damn proud of you, whom he undoubtedly saw as the new expression of the powerful, and forgive me, chingon arm of the strategic civil rights movement that has done so much to say, ya basta, enough. Malta, with your leadership, has creatively and brilliantly pushed back against the oppression of Latinos and Latinas in the U.S., and you have solidified Justice Reynoso's early understanding that the struggle for immigrant rights is also a struggle for civil rights and also a struggle for racial justice in this country. So I want to begin by asking each of you to please spend 5 minutes or so sharing how you knew Justice Reynoso and to reflect on how his presence in your life influenced and will continue to influence your own work and the work of your respective institutions that you lead or have led. We'll start with Jose and then move to Magda and finally to Tom.
Yes. First of all, I wanted to apologize for that for personal medical reasons, I cannot be there in person. So I wanted to thank Dean Johnson for giving me this honor to participate today on this panel, remembering the legacy of our friend, mentor, hero, champion of the poor, Justice Cruz Reynoso. Justice Reynoso was all those things, but in these next few minutes, I focus on 3 sides of Cruz. Cruz, the rural attorney, Cruz, the political role model, and Cruz, the common person. Cruz, the rural attorney, like my fellow panel members, I was blessed to have personally known Justice Reynoso. A few years ago, when I spoke at another event here at UC Davis honoring the justice, I noted that long before I met Cruz, I knew of him as the rural lawyer. My own roots are rural, border. Having been born and raised in Imperial County in the 1950s and 60s, where Justice Reynoso had a private practice. When Justice Reynoso practiced in the Reynoso Duddy law firm, he represented rural workers in workers' compensation and disability claims. My own background was farm worker. My grandparents and parents picked in the agricultural fields of that valley. And Justice Reynoso practiced there as the first Spanish surnamed attorney in the valley. So within that Latino community, Cruz became known to practice on weekends from his home where he lived with Janine and where the workers would go to seek his legal counsel. I once said that Justice Reynoso was legal aid before legal aid even existed in Imperial Valley. And for me personally, Cruz was the first Latino attorney I had heard of in that valley. And in that sense, he was a role model for the attorney I would later become and also practice after UC Berkeley in that same valley when I practiced there with CRLA from 1978 to 1984. Let me talk about Cruz and his as a political role model. So it was during this period in the 60s when Cruz's life crossed with CRLA. His employment and relationship with CRLA would prove to be a political challenge of national consequence In 1966, Cruz became a founding member of CRLA. He joined on that founding board, he joined labor leaders Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Lariat Leon. Lariat Leon was the Filipino organizer who led the first grape strike in California's picking fields. In that context, Cruz was selected to be the board on the CRLA board as its first chairperson. And 3 years after CRLA's founding, by its founder Jim Lawrence, Cruz would then become CRLA's second executive director in 1969. And so in that early history, CRLA was unique in two ways. CRLA was the first statewide legal aid program in the country, and CRLA was the first legal aid to provide services to farm workers. So that was the CRLA Cruz led in 1969. So in that role as director from 1969 to 1972, Cruz engaged in a national political struggle that challenged Governor Ronald Reagan's veto of CRLA funding, federal funding. The Reagan political interference came in the name of California agriculture, and CRLA would survive that, but it had profound national consequences. Because of that interference by the state governor, legal aid then became nationalized. It led to the creation of the current federal legal aid framework. It led to the passage of the Legal Services Corporation Act back there in the early 70s. And it was that law that established that Congress, without any state involvement, would provide annual legal aid funds to programs. And there today are 130 of them, of which CRLA has one. And these are the ones that currently provide legal aid to the civil legal aid to the poor all over the country. But the concept was that the funding flowed through a federal agency, the Legal Services Corporation. And so by doing that, it excluded any state political interest, like agriculture, from interfering as it had done in Reynoso's time when Governor Reagan came after him. And so just as agriculture had done in Cruz's time, the dairy industry politically interfered with us. And so just as CRLA fought with agriculture during Cruz's time, the dairy industry came after us in the early 2000s when Congressman Bill Thomas in 2003 to 2007, during that period, he decided to have us investigated by the Legal Services Corporation. Why? Because of our own very, very successful litigation against the dairy industry. During that time, CRLA was very successful through its litigation. We were winning settlements against the dairy of $100,000, $200,000, and we even we had a $500,000, $500,000 settlement. During that period, we settled cases worth more than $1.3 million. But just like the ag industry, dairy then decided to have us investigated. They had us investigated from 2000 to 2003, it was in 2004. And they asked that I go before the subcommittee in Congress that funded legal aid. It was the subcommittee on commerce and administrative law, headed by a congressman out of Utah, Congressman Chris Cannon. And so I testified before that committee because the dairy industry wanted our labor litigation to stop. And so for me, during that period of time, it was Justice Reynoso's leadership example during the Reagan times that guided me through that similar political effort to defund us some 40 years later. And I would always tell myself during that time, I literally would say, what would Cruz do in a situation like this? But anyway, we successfully defended ourselves before Congress when I gave that testimony. So let me end my comments this way, talking about Cruz as the person Cruz that I knew, the common person, the common man. I wanted to say that Cruz was, as I knew him, was a very religious and moral person who acted from all of those religious values, and he used those values to act in an uncommon way. Humility was part of his essence. He had the ability to treat the person in front of him, whether that was a farm worker, a law student, a politician, with utmost respect, treating you as if you were the most important person, as important as any person of high political position. A worker in his presence would feel equally as important as a Supreme Court justice in his presence. That was a very special personality trait, so rare, so uncommon, but very special in Cruz, the man. Cruz, at the same time, was a very religious person. He lived by those morals. As a matter of fact, my wife was reminding me, my wife, Deborah Escobedo, who is a lawyer, is with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, was reminding me about that moral man that Cruz was. Justice Reynoso did not drink. Justice Reynoso did not smoke. Justice Reynoso did not dance. And Justice Reynoso did not swear. If he was angry, it was said that Justice Reynoso might be heard to swear, saying something like, "Oh, darn." That was Justice Reynoso. So on that light note, I am thinking of our Sierra Leone legal aid work. It now has extended more than 50 years after Cruz led us. We continue doing major education advocacy, major labor cases. Even during that period, we were the ones that helped legislate the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, when millions of immigrants were able to secure legal status. All of those efforts may never have come to pass, but for Justice Reynoso's leadership when Governor Reagan sought to defund us. And so he saved Sierra Leone for all of those hundreds of Sierra Leone attorneys who have come after him to serve the same farm workers and to serve the same rural communities that he served and Sierra Leone served during his time. And so I say Cruz Reynoso presente. And with that, I thank Dean Johnson again for letting me speak. Thank you.
Learning about Justice Reynoso in my first year of law school, when I attended a public interest law day in San Francisco and heard Jose Padilla talk about Sierra Leone. Following his presentation, I approached Jose and told him I was a daughter of farm workers and that I hoped that he would consider me for a position with Sierra Leone after law school because my community needed a Sierra Leone lawyer. That evening, I went home and I researched all about Sierra Leone and I learned about its history, its accomplishments, and about a trailblazing director who fought a governor and prevented the elimination of legal services for the poor. That director was Justice Cruz Reynoso. Like Justice Reynoso, I wanted to become a lawyer because there was no Spanish-speaking lawyers in the agriculture community where I grew up. As a child, during the summers, I remember Border Patrol agents coming onto the ranch where we lived and my parents worked as farm workers. And the Border Patrol agents would, at the end of the day, come onto the ranch and be chasing the workers. The first time that I saw the Border Patrol agents on the ranch, I asked my parents why the police were chasing the workers. And my parents told me that they wanted to deport them because they were undocumented. Growing up with a lot of these families, I got to be very close with them, and And I would look at the workers and I would look at my parents. And I would ask, and I'm like, well, do we need to hide? Do we need to run too? And my parents said, no, I mean, you were born in the United States, so you can never be deported. And so I asked them, well, were you born in the United States? And they're like, no, but we have papers. And so at that moment, I asked myself, well, what can I do to make sure that everyone can have these important papers so that they do not have to live in fear of being deported? While working as a member of the Congressional Select Commission on Immigrant and Refugee Policy, appointed by President Jimmy Carter, Justice Reynoso helped write a report and presented recommendations that later became part of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which allowed close to 3 million undocumented individuals to obtain lawful permanent resident status. 1.2 million of them farm workers. A couple years after the passage of IRCA, I was fortunate to be admitted to King Hall and accepted in the immigration clinic, where as a law student I had the opportunity to help farm worker families to legalize and protect immigrant families from separation that Justice Cruz Reynoso considered to be a violation of human rights. In my third year of law school, I had the privilege of meeting Justice Reynoso in person when he attended an interview for the law school dean position. As chair of the La Raza Law Student Association and the Law Student Association, I had the opportunity to meet with Justice Reynoso and hear about his vision to recruit and retain students of color and create a learning experience and environment that will support student success. Students were in awe of Justice Reynoso and thought he was a perfect candidate for Dean of King Hall. Unfortunately, agribusiness was more powerful than the students, and he was not offered the position, which led me to organize my first ever teach-in in protest of what I considered the university's failure to do the right thing. Luckily for me, Costa Padilla did hire me to work at CRLA after graduation, and Justice Reynoso was a keynote speaker at every CRLA staff conference, inspiring us through his social justice trajectory. In 1996, Congress passed restrictions preventing federally funded legal services organizations like CRLA from representing undocumented immigrants, engaging in class action litigation, and providing legislative advocacy. CRLA's legislative advocates, Director of Community Advocacy, and I left CRLA and went to work for CRLA Foundation to continue our joint mission of providing comprehensive legal representation and advocacy on behalf of the rural poor. I subsequently became CRLA Foundation's executive director and relied heavily on Jose and Justice Reynoso to teach me how to be a legal services director. CRLA Foundation was created in 1981 when CRLA was threatened once again with defunding in an effort to prevent CRLA from continuing its war on poverty. Since its founding, CRLA Foundation has not only shared Justice Reynoso's commitment to safeguarding of the civil rights and the interests of California's farm workers and the rural poor, but it has adopted this commitment as its core mission. CRLA Foundation's history is deeply intertwined with Justice Reynoso's legacy of service to those most in need, of championing the rights of the rural poor through the application of law to ensure true justice for all, as he called it, and following his example of excellence in the provision of legal services. As Dean Johnson and Professor Adana mentioned, thanks to Dean Hirschbacher and Dean Johnson, King Hall was able to bring Justice Reynoso as a full-time professor and the inaugural holder of the Blue Cheever and Bird chair for the study of teaching and freedom and equality in 2001. For the next 19 years, I had the distinct honor of working with Justice Reynoso as co-faculty advisor of the La Raza Law Student Association, co-counseling with him on civil rights cases, and following his footsteps to learn as much as I could. He invited me to speak during Intro Week about my work as a public interest lawyer and join him on the Levy Shorts in a court. And I invited him to serve as advisor to CRLA Foundation, speak to at our immigration forums and CRLA Foundation's Luchando por Justicia events, which he did so gracefully and passionately. His impact on me personally is immeasurable. He was my hero, my mentor, my friend. Whether it was at the inter-court meetings, at faculty meetings, political meetings, law school graduations, Latino banquets, or community events, we always managed to arrive at about the same time. And one time, I had a person ask me if I was Justice Reynoso's driver, which I would have been honored to do. Timing is everything, and whether it was divine intervention or just pure life, we always arrived at the same time, and he always reserved the space for me next to him, letting me know that I belonged and I had a right to be there. One of the greatest privileges for me as a Chicana social justice lawyer is having had the opportunity to interact with, be inspired by, and sit at the table with Justice Cruz Reynoso, and of course have Mexican hot chocolate and pan dulce every Wednesday and Thursday morning. Thank you.
So I too want to start by thanking Dean Johnson for including me, and I want to thank all of you who are here in person with us virtually for joining us in celebrating all the many contributions of Justice Reynoso. The sheer length of time that he contributed to justice and law requires me to begin long before I knew who he was, long before I even had much of a sense of what civil rights was or what law was. And that is to note that Cruz served on MALDEF's board of directors in the mid-1970s. And so despite my gray hair, I was still in grade school. But I want to point out what an important era it was for my organization, MALDEF, at the time that Cruz served on the board. So this was less than a decade after MALDEF was founded. And it was during the tenure of our first long-term president and general counsel, Vilma Martinez. The mid-70s, she's a woman leading a civil rights organization. You can imagine how unusual that was in the mid-1970s. And I think having Cruz on the board at the time was of great assistance to her in helping to navigate what was, by its very nature, difficult for a woman in the 1970s to be leading a national civil rights organization. Vilma is a good friend. I asked her about Cruz's service, and she assured me that he was important and helpful. And she said to me that what she recalls most is that though they came to the law and civil rights from different perspectives, because his career had been in CRLA, therefore very knowledgeable of the challenges faced by rural Latinos, and Vilma came to civil rights from a very urbanized perspective, having begun her civil rights career as an LDF lawyer in New York City. But she said to me that despite those different backgrounds, they spoke a common language of caring for people and for the progress of the Latino community. So that's long before I had any idea who Cruz Reynoso was. But I will say that before I met him, Cruz was a role model, because like many of you, I'm the first lawyer in my family. And I certainly did not know Latino lawyers growing up. I didn't know many lawyers, period. If I think about it, there may have been one school board member, a white lawyer, in my community as I was growing up. So to have someone, Cruz, appointed the first Latino on the California Supreme Court when I was in high school certainly influenced my path, solidified my path, my interest in becoming a lawyer, and in particular becoming a civil rights lawyer. Then, of course, and I think this is critically important, I was a 20-year-old voter in 1986. So this would be one of the first elections I had had a chance to vote in. And we faced the retention election that resulted, unfortunately, in Cruz and 2 other justices being removed from the California Supreme Court. But that was so long ago, I want to emphasize what it meant. It was a tremendous injustice. These justices were targeted by right-wing forces in California, seeking to change the fact that so many of the justices had been appointed by Democratic governors. As I look back, think we can't separate that injustice, and in particular, that Cruz was targeted together with the Chief Justice who became at least superficially the main target of the campaign. I don't think it's an accident that the one Latino justice and the first Latino justice was also targeted by the right wing in 1986. And in this sense, looking back, I can't separate that occurrence from what we faced just a few years later in the 90s in California, with the right wing championing so many anti-Latino measures on the ballot to take political advantage, beginning with the notorious Proposition 187. But as a voter, I was disappointed that Cruz was not retained, because I, of course, voted to retain him. And I had a deep sense of how unjust it was to have this first Latino justice, who was a role model for so many of us, be removed in such an unjust manner. And this gets to where I had the first opportunity to meet Cruz in person. Because of their working together in the 1970s, on occasion, when Cruz was visiting Los Angeles, he would stay with Vilma Martinez and her family at their home in the center of Los Angeles. And one day, Vilma had become at that point a mentor, professional mentor of mine, and she has remained to this day. She and I had gone to dinner. We were returning to her home, and to my great surprise, I didn't expect this, we walked into her home, and who's there? Cruz Reynoso. Person I never met, but of course I knew as an icon, first Latino Supreme Court Justice. And if I had been asked, I didn't know I would meet him, if I had been asked, what do you expect? Based on what I saw as a voter in 1986, I would have expected to see someone who would understandably be a little bitter. This was only 5, 6, 7 years from that terrible election. I would have expected someone to be a little beaten. But of course, that's not Cruz. He took that tremendous personal injustice and turned it in to a career in academia of inspiration and instruction for generations and generations of students, Latino students and non-Latino students. So the Cruz that I met that night was the one that you've all heard about, and probably many of you knew. The calm, sweet demeanor, gentle, very personable icon. Not what I expected from an icon. One of the first Latino lawyers, justices I had any conception of as I was solidifying my path of going to law school. So That first experience was, of course, played out every time I ever ran into Cruz. He was always calm, sweet demeanor, and very interested, as Jose said, in whomever he was talking to. And I will say my experience with Cruz was we would recurrently run into each other by happenstance at events. He would be speaking, I would be speaking, we would both be speaking, we would both be attending an event, generally for Latino students, because he so valued Latino law students and Latino students. Every time I ran into him, I thought to myself, I'm so fortunate, every time I run into Cruz, I have something I need to ask him about. Then I realized it's just that whenever you run into Cruz, you would find something that you would want to get his input about, because you would want his wisdom in framing your ultimate decision. And he was, without exception, unfailingly generous with his thoughts, unfailingly respectful with his thoughts, and unfailingly wise in what he would tell me, well, no matter what the issue was. And what I would say was most, in my view, impactful about that experience over and over again was that he had to recognize as an icon in Latino civil rights that he could tell someone like me what to do, and I would likely do it. But he always gave you his advice with extreme respect for your own agency and your own decision making. So you left those conversations never feeling pushed or pressured in any way. You would know you had gotten wise advice, but without feeling coerced in any way to go the way that Cruz would want you to go. He left you with your complete agency and decision making in every one of those conversations. So to me, he started out as a role model of a Latino civil rights lawyer and jurist, and he developed into a role model of how we should all deal with each other as human beings. Despite his clearly having an understanding that he was an icon, he dealt with everyone, as Jose said, in a way that was respectful of their dignity, of their agency, and of their humanity. And that, I think, is what I will miss the most about Cruz, is those opportunities to run into him and have the opportunity to ask him for whatever burning issue was on my mind.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to each of you. I'm going to ask a question to each of you, but I do want the audience to also get an opportunity to ask questions. Jose, Justice Reynoso's career in Sierra Leone both propelled his stature as a leading Latino jurist, but also represented for him significant political challenges, both in his appointment to the California Supreme Court and perhaps also leading to his eventual recall. Could you reflect a bit more on this and perhaps draw lessons for young lawyers today who both aspire to do civil rights work, but who can also perhaps imagine themselves in the bench? What advice do you think Justice Reynoso would want to give those young lawyers?
Well, again, it's appreciate the comments that Tom was making about asking Justice Reynoso for advice, because he's totally correct in the fact that Justice Reynoso was always willing to speak to you and give you his wisdom and his insights, given the things that he had gone through. I remember also when he was, I guess he was on the one subcommittee. He asked me to testify in front of the Civil Rights Commission that he was on, but I remember when he always approached me, he always personalized it. It's almost like he was a relative or something. And even after all that time that I spent with CRLA and going through all of the my own political issues with the dairy, et cetera, and testifying from that Congressional Committee and all of that, and I would talk to Cruz, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Hi," and he would say, "Josecito," always Josecito. And to me, it was like that personalizing of that kind of a father figure in some sense was the way he first began talking, and then you engaged him at the level that you needed. But this question about law students who want to go into civil rights practice, I want to say that to me, whether you are a law student wanting to go into civil rights practice, going into immigration practice, going into labor rights practice, Cruz would tell you to always do that work with your utmost passion. Most of you, like Tom had said, and Professor Perez had said, we came and became lawyers as the first lawyers in our families. And I'm sure many of you there find yourselves in that same position. And we didn't know who to go to until we would run into that, as Tom said, that role model. But I think Cruz would say, whatever passion it was that got you into law school, whether you, maybe one of your family members was represented because they were immigrants, for whatever reason, he would say that passion that led you to UC Davis Law, never lose that passion when you are representing our communities. The workers, the low-wage workers, if that's a labor practice you get into as part of what you're going to do, if you do civil rights work with a legal aid, you should always work from the heart. Work hard and work harder. Prepare, always be ready. Always be the best lawyer you can, because that is what our communities need. You put in all that time because that farm worker client wants you to be the best lawyer there when you are representing him or her in that labor hearing. The immigration attorney that you're going to be when you're representing that immigrant worker who's being deported. During that time that I was in El Centro, those 5-6 years that I was there, I practiced in immigration court in the El Centro Immigration Detention Center and did maybe about 10, 11 deportation cases. That is work that you know you must be successful in because your client is going to be sent out of the country. Their children are going to go with them out of the country. That's why you become that best immigration lawyer. And so I think what Cruz would say is, whether in any of that, always follow that passion and do the best work. With respect to the bench, if you've been doing that work and have that reputation in your resume, you are going to find supporters and you are going to find detractors. They're always going to be there because of that practice. But we all have to feel proud that that's what we chose. Our courts need to be diverse. Our courts need to have on those courts jurists who have come from those practices representing the poor, the urban poor, the rural poor, Latinos being discriminated against by schools, and some of that litigation, major litigation that Maldiv has done nationally, changing those school systems. In California, we have done that. But because of that, you will be focused, that history will come back and be a focus of somebody as a detraction. But that's when you say, no, I did this work because I was following my heart and because I was following my own role models who taught me to do this work with that passion, because the poor client, the low-income client, deserves it. I'm out. That's my advice.
Thank you. I think you probably are echoing Justice Reynoso accurately, for sure. So many have focused on Justice Reynoso's qualities as a human being. I like that you used the word caballero to describe him. And I really like this term because it translates in English to gentleman. And he certainly was gentle. And I think Tom also alluded to the fact that that's not what you expect when you meet someone who's such an icon and has accomplished so much. And I'm wondering, Amanda, if you can reflect a little bit about how these qualities serve Justice Reynoso advance his otherwise fierce civil rights role. What lessons should other civil rights lawyers learn from this part of Justice Reynoso's legacy?
As we've heard this afternoon, Justice Reynoso was a man of outstanding intellect, superior judicial performance, high integrity, and his rare personal qualities, namely his humility, kindness, and gentle nature. Many years ago, I think when I started as director, someone gave me a card with the saying, "Don't mistake kindness for weakness." When I look at this card that's on his door, I think of Justice Cruz Reynoso, who to many of us is embodiment of human kindness, humility, grace, and power. Despite so many awards, Justice Reynoso just remained so gracious and humble. His commitment to protecting the rights of farm workers and the rural poor earned him the trust and respect of farm workers who saw him as the personification of hope, as a justice warrior, the promise of justice, and a champion who believed that everyone should be treated with dignity and respect. I remember hearing him speak one afternoon, and he said, in schools they talk about teaching tolerance. But we shouldn't be teaching tolerance. We should be teaching respect. Because, tolerance is like you have to tolerate someone, but to respect someone, is to really value the person as a human being. And that just stayed with me. And I think just really kind of shaped the way that I wanted to teach as a social justice lawyer and professor. To his adversaries, Justice Reynoso was a gentleman rabble-rouser who never raised his voice, but relentlessly pursued justice for his clients, overcoming the economic and political power of growers and local officials with the power of the law and his humanity. When Justice Reynoso spoke, everyone listened. Justice Reynoso was respected for his unwavering moral compass, integrity, and adherence to the truth. And this, he was called upon by, as we've heard, presidents of the United States, state governors, presidents of the University of California to investigate civil rights violations, such as racial profiling by Black and brown people by the Los Angeles police, voting improprieties in Florida, the killing of a farm worker by Woodland police, and the pepper spraying of students by the UC Davis police during Occupy movement. However, there were many other less known causes that he undertook that changed the lives of the people he touched. Strongly believing that immigration rights were human and civil rights, he advocated for comprehensive immigration reform, helped undocumented students draft business plans that would allow them to practice law as independent contractors years before Sergio Garcia's case was litigated. He tutored elementary students and taught them how to read because he so believed in quality education. He taught freshmen seminars on civil rights, affirmative action, and the representation of Latinos in the legal profession. He volunteered at naturalization and DACA workshops, took cases no one else would, saw in countless Raza law graduates, and congratulated every parent for their daughters and sons' achievements. To Justice Reynoso, his work of national importance was as meaningful as his meetings with community members. As Jose mentioned, and others have mentioned as well, he treated officials, dignitaries, and farm workers with the same dignity and respect. His love of teaching and working with students allowed him to incorporate students into his civil rights investigations and advocacy. Through his example, he has inspired generations of lawyers, community advocates, and policymakers to fight valiantly and boldly against injustices. Observing Justice Reynoso in different forums and seeing how he effectively advocated for disenfranchised communities with his quiet yet commanding demeanor showed us that you do not have to be loud to be effective. This is a lesson that I share with law students who come to King Hall and desire to do social justice work, but wonder, like I did, if they have the right personality or strength of character to be effective. Justice Reynoso showed us that to be the lawyers that our communities need, all we need is to pay attention to our justice bones, to be willing to step up on behalf of the voiceless, and use the application of law to ensure justice for all. And despite, the concerns that we might have, again, about being forceful enough, when you're advocating for people who need representation and for something you strongly believe in, that power comes from within. It comes from the heart, right? And it was, the power that I think so many of us have seen through Justice Reynoso's advocacy. Justice Reynoso was a zealous defender of human and civil rights. His faith in humanity, respect for others, and dedication to the truth, fairness, equality, and moral excellence stand out as the qualities we all aspire to have as defenders and advocates of justice. However, it was his humility and kindness that made him the most impactful and wonderful human being those of us who had the privilege of working with him have ever known. Un caballero de justicia, a gentleman, defender of justice, who leaves generations of social justice advocates committed to carrying his legacy forward and to be the mentors, like he was, to generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. One final question, this one for Tom. When I teach immigration law and we spend quite a bit of time on constitutional law cases, it can get quite depressing actually because there's not many victories or any. So I try very much to feature the movements behind the cases and the organizations, the strategy. And one of the organizations that I feature is MALDEF, because MALDEF has been taking up the torch in strategic litigation to further the rights of Latinos and Latinas, and to frame it within a framework of racial justice and civil rights in the U.S. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the gains and challenges that you see both within the judiciary, the political sphere, and even among public opinion to not view immigrant rights as separate from civil rights or from racial justice in this country.
So I think I wanted to say first, as you noted, that Cruz Reynoso was one of those who recognized early the connection between Latino civil rights and immigrants' rights. And I want to say that to me that says two things about Cruz. So first, it really demonstrates that no matter how far away from frontline representation of Latino workers his formal role may have been, he always understood what the experiences of everyday Latinos were. I say that because Maldev has had an immigrant rights program since the 1970s under President General Counsel Vilma Martinez. And she has told me that that program emanated from the frontline staff attorneys because their experience was that's how Latinos every day experience discrimination, whether it was citizenship requirements that were not necessary on employment, or what eventually became Plyler versus Doe, kids being told you can't go to school because you are undocumented. So that recognition is a recognition of the real lived experience of Latinos in this country going back decades. So it reflects Cruz's ongoing understanding of that experience. But on the other hand, I think it reflects that Cruz was also a professor, an academic, someone who analyzes the law. Because I think from that perspective, it's hard not to note, as I do as often as I can to folks, that one major theme, a through line of the Latino civil rights struggle in this country, going back to Hernandez versus Texas in 1954, is the struggle to adapt civil rights doctrines that were primarily developed in a slightly different context of discrimination under Jim Crow against African Americans. But our struggle has been to take those doctrines, whether judicially created, as in Hernandez versus Texas, or created by civil rights statute, and struggling to take those laws developed for that other context and making them fit the experience of the Latino community, where, unlike the African American experience, so much discrimination is couched formally in terms that are not race, right? Oh, I'm not discriminating against you because you're Latino, but because you're undocumented, or because you're not a citizen, or because you don't speak English, or because you have an accent, or because fill in the blank. You've all had this experience. That's how the Latino community historically and throughout the civil rights era has experienced discrimination. It is not, we don't like you because you're Latino. Yes, that happens. Still does. We still challenge it. But so much of it is couched in other terms, other characteristics that we know in our hearts is racial discrimination. It's just through proxies in different language, different terminology. And our struggle continues to be, how do we make the judicial system, the justice system, recognize that our hearts that tell us this is racial discrimination are right, are correct, and that the law should recognize that these discriminations by proxy are as offensive to constitutional principles, to civil rights principles, as blatant racial discrimination. And it also has broader applications in the disparate impact doctrine and how it is being limited and attempts to eliminate it for all people of color. But I think that Cruz, having taken the stance early that he did, reflects both his analytical professor side and his connection to the people and everyday experience side as well. And I think, to just further expand on your question, that's what we have to do. Our struggle is really about taking everyday experience and translating it into legal doctrine. In a way, that's what all lawyers do. Our struggle is through the attempt to make civil rights laws that often are interpreted to be limited solely to intentional racial discrimination and using them and getting them adapted to address the everyday experience of discrimination by proxy. And it is an ongoing struggle. It is a reality that the right wing wants to eliminate disparate impact as a doctrine. The best example I'll give you, I'm doing a lot of thinking about voting rights these days, not just because of what we see following the big lie, not just because we're in the middle of redistricting, not just because we have the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act hopefully being acted on by the US Senate next week. But it is interesting to see that the right wing attempts to characterize Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the most important provision still operative of that foundational civil rights law. They attempt to characterize Section 2 as a disparate impact standard. When they do that, you know that that's their beginning attempt to eliminate Section 2. And in fact, we have to push back and point out that Section 2, which incorporates a totality of the circumstances test, a totality of the circumstances test, that is as close to an Arlington Heights standard for proving intentional racial discrimination as you can get. The totality of circumstances test is basically Arlington Heights adapted for the voting context. But the right wing wants to call it disparate impact. And I think it demonstrates what we have to do in response, consistent with the struggle I just described, but what we have to do in response to the pushback that we will continue to see from the right wing that wants to eliminate any successes we've had in adapting civil rights laws to the everyday experience of Latinos in the country.
Thank you so much. Questions from the audience or maybe on Zoom? Do we have any?
We don't have any on Zoom.
Okay. Anyone in the audience want to raise a question or speakers?
I will.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for being here. I don't know if I need to speak into a mic, but I'm not going to. Yeah, good. I had the pleasure of meeting Cruz about, I don't know, let's see, 11 years ago. Unfortunately, I spoke after him at an event, and it was an event that was to allow underrepresented minority students to get into the pipeline to law school. And it was, it was related to a community college and then also a four-year institution and then to go to law school and sort of this pipeline. And I just wanted to know if any of you can speak to kind of his dedication to ensuring, I mean, some of you touched on it a little bit, but ensuring that there is a strong pipeline of underrepresented students that are getting into law schools and sort of keeping that fight going.
So I think that Justice Reynoso had a strong commitment, and in speaking at the various law schools and in speaking through the programs, he wanted to create a space to say, you belong, right? And there's a place for you. And there's so many, I think, first generation students, whether it's at the high school level, the college level, or law school, that are kind of struggling to find that balance in doing the work that we came to law school for, and yet sometimes finding yourself kind of like alienated or being in a place that just doesn't seem responsive to. Sorry. Jose's probably on there too. So, I mean, it's also, you know, his dedication, even in teaching the freshman seminars, you know, was his way of creating that interest in that pipeline and in ensuring that, you know, they were the mentors along the way, you know, to keep students in school and to create that place like models like CRLA Foundation, where they could be the justice lawyers or whatever type of lawyer that they came to law school to be.
Hi, my name is Diana Fuentes Michelle, and I worked with Cruz Reynoso when he was the chair of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission. Under Gray Davis, I was undersecretary for education, and I was also the assistant secretary for higher education. As I've told my husband many times, I would not have been appointed undersecretary of education under Gray Davis unless Cruz Reynoso had mentored me when I was at the Post-Secondary Education Commission. I'm standing because in response to the question, what did Cruz do to increase the number of students who would be prepared to go to law school? During his tenure at the commission, he was chair of the Post-Secondary Education Commission in California after Bakke. After his unfortunate recall, he took leadership in the California legislature by not only mentoring the Chicano legislators on the importance of K-12 education and doing outreach and doing preparation. I had the privilege as Director of Governmental Affairs for the California Post-Secondary Education to accompany Cruz to many of the meetings that we had with members. And you have to recall that this was before DACA. You know, I became the director of the Student Aid Commission, and our commission was responsible for implementing DACA. And Cruz was very much a part of all of those discussions in the legislature. And so I think it would be important to note in his legacy that he took great interest in advancing from a systematic way the advancement of Latino students in higher education. He recognized very clearly one of the bills that we worked on during the 90s that I recall very clearly talking to members about was this notion of having individual representation within districts for school boards and for community college boards. And legislation was actually attempted that Cruz and I worked on during the early 1990s. So I think part of his legacy is this, not only education of folks to go into law school, but it was great to see that during a time in his life where the voters had rejected him, and then he came back through the educational system, and he did it in different ways. During the close to 25, 30 years that I knew him, at every event we'd always talk about particular issues that were in front of the legislature in education. And so I would think that I would be absent if I did not acknowledge not only his great contribution, particularly with DACA, because you have to recall then, and also unfortunately the late Marco Fireball, who was in the assembly at the time, and he worked alongside Richard Polanco. And unfortunately, I think this particular story hasn't been told about how that actually came about, because during the years of the Davis administration, many folks focus on the driver's legislation. They don't focus necessarily on the efforts that were occurring to do tuition, non-resident-based tuition for DACA students. That's how the whole process started in education. So there are many stories that Cruz would probably not put himself and give him credit for, but for those of us who worked with him, we knew that he was that driving force. I know for myself, I would have never thought to interview for the Assistant Secretary for Higher Education when we had the first governor in 16 years when Gray Davis was elected. And he was one of the persons that I talked to because he had been my boss at the commission. And I said, you know, I'm a woman, I just had a baby, we our daughter was like not even a year and a few months old. I was still breastfeeding her, and I have 2 other girls, and working full time and being a woman and taking that responsibility. And he was very encouraging, saying, "You can do it. You know, I'm sure many of us will help you do it." And so there are people I know that I've worked with that had the same experience with Cruz. He was so supportive of individuals having their own voice. And for students, I just have to say, I just wouldn't think a lot of the things that have happened in higher education, particularly after Bakke, with the representation issues, I know that he gave great advice and was a great voice and force in higher education in California. And I think that has to be said.
My name is Reynoso. I'm Cruz's son. To feed off what has been said about the education, Dad had a shotgun approach to education in everything about education. Not only did he help at the state level to try to get the system in place, and part of that system, of course, worked in the 80s and 90s, was the ability to go to the community college system, then the state college and the UC system, with the thought that people that didn't have the resources could make that path easier. He also went ahead and spoke. We talked about earlier about speaking at law schools. We also spoke at 4-year universities. We'd speak at colleges. He'd speak at high schools. I told Dean Johnson, I think, earlier tonight, that there was times growing up that Dad would leave the house some weekend in April, and we probably didn't see him until in June, because he was going to do commencement speeches everywhere. Anyone that asked him, he would go. Whether it was a high school, junior high, he didn't care. He was going to explain to people and his vision of how we can be empowered through education. And there's one, several times actually, but one in particular that I think he had 4 commencement speeches in one day. That's just what he did. And by the way, they weren't all in the same state. So it was very interesting to see what he do sometimes. But he would also come to the high school. I went to Galt High School in South Sacramento County. I was actually talking to an old retired teacher now, Mr. Millay, who did our government classes. Dad would come in every semester for him to teach a lecture about government to his government class. Mom and Dad supported when we used to have a constitution test in 8th grade, which we no longer apparently do, they would give a scholarship to the local kids for the people that did best on that test. Dad and Mom were very tied to education at all levels, and his feeling was that if you could encourage young people, we talked about him teaching second graders how to read, that was one of his last things he was doing. If he could encourage young people to stay in school, to keep on going to school, and all the way through law school, the broader our representation, the better we are all as a people. And he did that his entire life. And all of us, I have the least education, I guess, in terms of education involvement. I got, in our family, we have professors, we have school teachers, we have college recruiters. I only help on school boards and commissions and those type of things. So everyone in our family is involved in education in one way or the other, and has been over the years. My mom was actually a trustee for San Joaquin Delta College, and Dad's second wife was a trustee at a couple different community colleges. It's very important, but not just at the top, not just at the state level, but at every level we push everyone up, and we tell them that they can do and they can make a difference, and that we can all be part of the system and therefore be part of the solution. And I thought that
I know there's a reception and Dean Johnson was supposed to end at 6:30, is that right?
Just a quick thought.
Okay.
So we're the first and second presidents of the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association, and then we're eternally grateful to your father for lending his name to our organization. And both Brian and I, when we became presidents, we pledged to obviously follow his legacy and make the organization something that he would be proud of. And I met with your father when we first started it, and he was great. I unfortunately only got to meet him for the last 2 years of his life, but it was an honor to meet him. And I agree with with education. I'm a community college graduate. I was on the board of the community college. That's a really important institution for our community. In terms for all the law students and everyone else and the lawyers, I'm Brian's the current president because of my appointment, and I be involved in. Contact Brian if you want to link with the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association, if you want to put any projects together, if you think anything between the law schools and we also have a mentorship program. But talk about it.
Well, thank you for that plug, George. Judge Soto, excuse me, it takes a little bit of time to get used to.
Always George Steve.
But yes, as Judge Soto was saying, I'm the current president of the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association. We do have a mentorship program, so anybody who's interested, I would definitely welcome you to check out our website, crvasacramento.com. I'm proud to say that we have some members here of the Cruz Reynoso Bar Association on the panel. Magda Perez, Professor Aldana, and we also have a former recipient of the Defensor de Justicia Award, which we started in honor of Justice Reynoso, Dean Kevin Johnson, and we have a lifetime member here, Glenn Reynoso as well. So thank you very much for putting this panel together. It was very enlightening and very inspiring to see so many people who knew Justice Reynoso best to talk about his legacy and the impact that he had. Like George, I unfortunately only had the opportunity to meet Justice Reynoso later on in his life, but everything that everybody said today about him is spot on. He was so humble, so personable, so friendly. Everybody sought out his advice. I remember one time we went to Univision to talk about was it a naturalization event that we were having, and Justice Reynoso and George were interviewed by the presenter, and I remember they pulled him aside because they wanted to get Justice Reynoso's opinion on a current political matter, and just with the calm demeanor that he was able, and authority that he was able to speak, was very highly inspiring. The only thing that I would have to say that's left, for those who didn't have the opportunity to know him so well personally, what resources would you encourage people to reach out? I know there's a video that we were able to see at an event earlier this month that was held here also at King Hall. But is there anything else that people who are wanting more information about Justice Reynoso's life that they could look into?
I know that Dean Johnson, I know there's a video of an interview, a pretty lengthy interview that Dean Johnson did with Cruz Reynoso. That's actually really beautiful. It's very personable, and I believe it's linked to the invitation that we sent out. There was also a symposium with several contributions of people who wrote about his story. And I learned today that the Quiteyobi Center was starting to work on an oral history project that is still to be finished, but it's perhaps a series of interviews. There was a question on chat, or maybe a comment about, what can we do to document this story beyond the legal community, right? Because I think it's a really important story to tell. And the person who raised that question is a legal historian, a professor here at Davis. So if she's still on the panel, I'm going to turn it back to her. She's written quite a few wonderful books about other civil rights activists. So you should write a book. That'd be a good idea. That's your next project. But that's what I know. I don't know, Dean Johnson, if there are any other resources that you are aware of.
Well, I know that Cruz was about halfway through with his autobiography that may never get finished, unfortunately. And when I asked him about it on many occasions, and I read the first half, which goes through CRLA, but I asked him, why can't you finish it? And he said, well, there's a lot more interesting things for me to think about. Which tells you a little bit about him.
There are a couple of oral histories that have been done. UC Berkeley and UC Davis both have some done different times. Berkeley's was done about 20 years ago. Davis was done, or is in the process of being done now. There are on YouTube several lengthy videos that are either interviews on a college they did. There's some events from the Civil Rights Commission, those type of things. You can get a flavor for what Dad was. We do have the first 6 chapters of the book. At some point, we'll be able to let that be more public knowledge, and yeah, hopefully will. And that book's kind of nice because those chapters are nice. It takes Dad's early history and brings it up to where he became a known political figure and professional figure. And most of the documentations that we have done professionally start really in the late 70s, early 60s. So this kind of will hopefully balance that out, even though he didn't finish it. And one of the reasons he didn't finish it is he was so concerned to make sure he was precise. He was double checking all the facts. But he was doing that in his late 70s and 80s, and a lot of the people he had to take the facts with were no longer with us. So it made it very difficult. So he was very precise in what he was trying to do as he was in all of his work. But at some point, hopefully, we'll be able to have that out too. But there are if you look on YouTube, there are quite a few things available there. We also have families donated, it's got to be close to 200 file boxes of historical documents from Dad to Shield's Library. So there is a plethora of resources there as well.
Great, this also is being transcribed and will be published by what is the journal? The UC Davis Journal of
Social Justice.
Social Justice. So that will also be in writing. Well, with that, I think we want to end tonight's program and thank our fabulous speakers tonight for sharing their stories about Justice Reynoso. Thank you so much for coming. There is a reception in the courtyard, and please join us for some refreshments and some more discussions among yourselves, remembering our beloved Cruz Reynoso. Thank you.